Welcome to the Veritas Forum, engaging university students and faculty in discussions about life's hardest questions and the relevance of Jesus Christ to all of life.
Thank you so much. Thanks for that introduction. It's fabulous to be here. I really appreciate the audience and the attention. This is my first year teaching at Penn, and I've had the opportunity to meet a lot of students so far, but of course there are so many I haven't met, so I'm really looking forward to meeting as many of you as I can, so please feel free to come up and say hi afterwards. I'm going to say a couple words about my research in Sri Lanka and how it led me to rethink what music is, how we know about it, rethink the relationship between music and the self, rethink what music is in society. And in some ways it's kind of a radical perspective, but I hope you'll view it as a quite positive one, ultimately. So I began studying music in India when I did a semester abroad when I was a university student. And I went to the University of Chicago thinking I was going to study North India. I also performed Javanese gamelan at the time, a genre from Indonesia. And one day, I remember it very well, it was circa 2003, I had a job in the Recordings Institute at the University of Chicago, recording section of the library, and there was mounds of snow outside, and I thought, is there anywhere I could study in South Asia that's a beautiful tropical island? Let me see. Now, I wasn't naive, I knew about Sri Lanka's political problems, etc., but I saw Sri Lanka on a map and thought, why has there really not been much research on Sri Lanka? And for those of you who don't know, Sri Lanka is an island off the southeastern tip of India. So I did some research on it, and one of the first things that pretty much any book will tell you on Sri Lanka, including academic books, is that Sri Lanka is divided ethnically. Sri Lanka is a nation consisting of about 70% Sinhala Buddhist. That's the majority ethnic group, about 18% Tamil Hindu, and about 8% Muslim, and Muslim is actually an ethnic category in Sri Lanka. But most of the Muslims speak the Tamil language, and I won't get into the history of why that is, why the ethnic categories are broken down that way here. So I had this sort of ethnic map in my mind, but I had never actually been to the country before, and so it was interesting to know this. It was just sort of what I gathered from text. And I show up to the country, and I'm studying drumming. I'm studying Sinhala Buddhist drumming in an area called Kandy in the Highlands. I'd only been there for a couple weeks, 2004. And a linguist friend of mine was in town, and he said, why don't you come along to an interview with me? And I said, sure. So I go along with this interview, and lo and behold, he was doing language on Sri Lankan Malay, a dialect of the Malay language. It turns out that there's a tiny minority of Malay people there. So I come along on this interview, and lo and behold, the first musician I wind up interviewing in Sri Lanka is not Sinhala Buddhist, not Tamil Hindu, not Muslim. Well, he technically is Muslim, but not considered part of the Muslim ethnic group in Sri Lanka. The first musician I recorded was a Sri Lankan Malay person who sang songs for me one day in 6 languages. And he was perfectly at home in all these languages. And of course, he had his own sort of Malay spin on these songs, but he sang Hotel California, he sang Sinhala pop music, he sang Tamil pop music, and I thought, what is this? And that was the beginning of this sort of crack of my association of music, language, and identity, and place even, right? So this boundary sort of started to crack right there. The second thing, if I can tell a story very quickly here, I noticed that my linguist friend brought along some gifts with him to his informants. He brought some fruit, some bananas and whatnot, some sweets. And as soon as he gave them to the informants, their just demeanor totally changed. And it immediately dawned on me, I had been taking these drum lessons, I've been paying my teacher for money for the lessons, sort of thinking money, knowledge is something that should be exchanged through money, right? And I realized I hadn't thought of the most basic generosity of the gift. And so after that, in the next lesson, I go and I decide I'm going to bring some bananas as a gift to my gracious host, thinking fruit is a suitable gift. And I bring him these bananas, and he smiles, and he was very friendly about it, takes them back to the kitchen. And I start playing drums, and then I'm looking around his yard, and I noticed his yard is filled with banana trees. So immediately I thought, this is so stupid. Why did I do this? And it was just kind of a dumb little story that sat with me in the back of my mind. And then it was only years and years later, literally about maybe 5 years later, when it dawned on me that music for the people I was studying is actually a gift. Music was sort of like the bananas. Music, the ritual that I was studying, which unfortunately I won't be able to get into too much detail here, but essentially music was a kind of offering in a religious context where the people are Buddhists, but they worship deities as well as the Buddha, and they give offerings to the deities, including music, including dance, incense, food, and so forth. And through those offerings, the deities accept their gifts, but in a disinterested fashion, because that's kind of how gift-giving works in Buddhism. And as an offering of thanks, they will protect the community. So essentially, what I was studying was not music as an expression of the self or expression of the community in the first instance. Music was actually a gift. It was something you could hold. It was something that does things. It had this kind of efficacious power upon its offering. And this led me to really rethink what music means in the world as a whole, because I started thinking, what if we tell cultural history not as a history of identity and thus difference, but we view music as something that connects people to one another? And if we start thinking of cultural history and music history as a history of the gift, then music history becomes less about ethnic difference. And so I realized as I was in Sri Lanka, and again, unfortunately, I don't have time to get into this too much detail, but I was there at a very difficult time in the country's history at the end of the Civil War. And after I left the country in 2004, my first trip there, the tsunami disaster happened. All these places I had just visited were destroyed, and I became immersed in the ethnic politics of the country, and then the Civil War started up again. I met musicians whose sons were killed in the war, etc. And I sort of thought, is there a way that I can not just sort of regurgitate these ethnic boundaries? And essentially, I realized with the genre I was studying that there's actually all these histories of relationships between ethnic groups in the country embedded in the genre I was studying. So essentially, my book, which I'm working on now, is a history of the transformation of this genre through what I call this kind of music package, this idea we know what music is, it's an expression of the self, it's an expression of community. And I'm sort of looking at how that discourse has actually affected this indigenous Buddhist way of looking at music as a kind of sacred offering. And so in a nutshell, and just to sort of conclude here, I don't want you to think of what I'm saying as an entirely negative thing, as in, if you think music is an expression of yourself, that I'm not saying that's wrong. That's great. However, I think we need to be very careful of what it is when we talk about music, especially in relation to identity. And I'll just end here with a quote I have from Paul Gilroy, who says, quote, "Music is often identified as being expressive of the absolute essence of the group that produced it, and thought to be emblematic and constitutive of racial difference rather than just associate with it." So once again, I'll just conclude by asking the question, what if we retell music history as a history of the gift rather than a history of the self? Thanks.
Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be with you tonight. Many moons ago, I went to college. After years of studying the piano, I started the piano when I was 7 years old and declared when I was 9 to my parents that I would become a concert pianist and play on the world stages. And they, of course, were gripped with fear. What kind of delusion has captured the mind of this child? But I went on to play. I was serious about it. And I started practicing 2 and 3 hours a day. And my entree into music was very much an experiential one. Playing the works of Beethoven, of Bach, of Mendelssohn, of Mozart, and Haydn gave me a glimpse to something that was otherworldly, something that was transcendent. And I could feel that in a very visceral way, even though I was quite young. So after having a few successes as a performer, I went off to college. At the behest of my parents, I got a broad education at a liberal arts institution instead of going to a conservatory. And I was assigned to a mentor by the name of Professor Louise Voskerchen. And she was this compelling personality who loved to play. She was a dynamite pianist, and she happened to have been a student of Nadia Boulanger, who in the 1920s in France, had influenced many, many contemporary composers, including some of the greats of this country, like Aaron Copland. So I entered her office, and I came to know and love her wisdom and what she had to share. And one day I opened up the Harvard Independent. It was a newspaper, and it turned out that they had interviewed her about, music at Harvard, and she happened to be speaking about me. And it was a little blurb about my work at Harvard. And she said, I'm paraphrasing, Mia can play just about anything, technically, but she has no clue what she's playing. And I thought, whoa. Now I'm going to have to come to terms with this comment. There's something about me accessing the music from a playing standpoint, from a physical and emotional standpoint. But then I knew I had to learn something about it. I was deeply humbled. Humbled because I felt like every moment that I grew closer to knowing something, I was that much further away from it. So I began to plunge myself into the works of many of the classical composers, namely Mozart and Beethoven and Schumann and Bach. And for the last 20 years, this quest for greater understanding has informed my teaching profoundly. That one statement changed the course of my career. So what I'm about to present to you tonight is actually some of the things that I study in class with my students. These are the things that have captured my imagination as a practicing Christian, as one who follows Jesus Christ. And the person that I felt best captured the story of suffering and transcendence is Ludwig van Beethoven, living between the years of 1770 and 1827. I don't think there's a better example of a person who lived a life of suffering and through music was able to transcend his physical ailments. Now, you probably have seen this in movies like Immortal Beloved and many others. The Man Upstairs, for example, a kid's movie on Beethoven. That Beethoven's greatest challenge was his deafness, which he discovered was starting to happen around 1798. So he is 28 years old, at the height of his powers, living in Vienna, becoming a huge star, and definitely the next one to carry the mantle that Mozart and Haydn are now handing on to him, passing on to him. Vienna was expecting great things. But he came upon this truth that the very faculty that he needed most to reach his greatest potential, or to fulfill the potential that he knew was within him, was at jeopardy, in jeopardy. And in 1802, he wrote a document called the Heiligenstadt Testament, in which he articulates very clearly his emotional state. He was depressed, nearly at the point of committing suicide. But he said this, he said, now art is the only thing that's going to get me out of this. That's going to keep me going and give me hope. And so what he does, subsequent to 1802, 1803, after expressing that deep depression, was he plunges himself into his compositional work, but with a renewed sense of energy and determination. And so you have works like the Eroica Symphony, his third symphony, which has really changed the course of symphonic writing, the Fifth Symphony in C minor, you all know. Right? Everybody knows this famed Fate motive, right, in that symphony. You have the Emperor Concerto, E-flat major, et cetera, et cetera. All these great works, the ones that we know best and know and love, okay, and have become popularized, come from this period after his deep depression. Now, the work I'm going to talk to you about, and I hope I can do this quickly, is the Opus 110 Piano Sonata in A-flat. It's his penultimate sonata. It's the 31st of 32 sonatas that he composed, and it was written in 1821. So fast forward, I've just talked about 1802, 1803. We're moving ahead towards the end of his life. Okay, so this is just 6 years before he dies. And he was in the grips of a very difficult physical state. He was suffering from jaundice. There are all these sort of theories about why he grew deaf. No one really knows definitively why. But he had all sorts of ailments, typhus, jaundice. Some people thought that he had this perpetual viral infection that was causing him to cough and have diarrhea persistently, all these different things. So after a very difficult spring and summer in 1821, he suddenly felt better. And he had been composing something called the Missa Solemnis, which is the solemn mass. And Beethoven then takes a break, he turns to piano sonatas, and he writes this 31st sonata. And to me, this most explicitly demonstrates the concept of suffering and transcendence. Okay, so let me, if I can do like the Cliff Notes version, I don't know what the internet version of Cliff Notes is nowadays, but in my day, it was the Cliff Notes, those little books, right? I'm going to give you a snapshot of this work. Forgive me if it's an injustice, too much of an oversimplification of an exceedingly complex and profound work, but I'm going to try to do this best as I can. I'm going to actually address the two movements, the middle movement and the final movement of this work. Because one of the things that Beethoven loved tremendously was the idea of pairing opposites. The juxtaposition of dark, of light, of conflict, of peace, of the profane and the sacred. This is a recurring theme in so many of his works. And by doing this between movements, he actually makes the movements stick together like glue. Because when you have the North Pole and the South Pole, what do you have? Natural attraction. And this is what happens between movements in his work. So the second movement is what I describe as the profane. And he articulates in the second movement two common ditties, very crass, something that people on the streets of Vienna would have recognized. Here's the first. Okay. 6-note idea. Descending scalar idea. And actually that comes from the tune, Our Cat Had Kittens. Unser Katz Katzen gehabt. Okay, what a horrible German accent I have. Okay, so here's the second ditty. Ich bin Luderlich, du bist Luderlich. I'm a Slav, you're a Slav. Okay, now, the use of this vernacular tune is actually born out of personal experience. And according to the 19th century biographer, Alexander Thayer, Beethoven actually experienced a very demeaning situation on the streets of Vienna when he was peering through the window, the curtains of a nobleman's house. So he was kind of peeking in to see who lived in this beautiful home, and a policeman came up to him and said, "What are you doing? What are you looking at? Who are you?" And he said, "I'm Beethoven," of course, who was a great star. And the policeman says, "Beethoven? You're not Beethoven, you're a Slav." So, So this idea of I'm a Slav, you're a Slav is really it's a personal reference to him. Now keep in mind, in the late phase of Beethoven's life, when he was completely deaf, by 1821, living in a world of silence. So all the music that's emanating is really from his mind's inner ear. There's no input, there's only output. So we get the purest utterings of his soul. Okay, now I'm going to juxtapose this with the sacred nature of the final movement. Okay? Transition to the third movement goes like this. Third movement. And then we hear a recitative. Now, recitative is a musical version of spoken speech. In other words, it's very syllabic in its rhythm. It's supposed to imitate speech. After recitative, we're going to hear something called aria, which means song. And after aria, we're going to hear fugue, the most complex musical construct in Western music. Why these three tools? These three tools are symbols of the Mass. So you remember he was composing the Missa Solemnis earlier in the year. They're symbolic references to sacred music. Okay? So here's the recitative. Here comes the aria. In the aria, it's written, he writes this notation in Italian and German. When he uses two languages, you better watch out, because that means I really mean this, okay? He writes, klangender Gesang, arioso dolente, which means lamenting song. So it's this incredibly poignant, soulful, emotional outpouring after the recitative. And what follows, the tragic nature of this aria, is something quite extraordinary. Before I move on, let me just notate, this aria, 6-note descending idea, taken right off of Our Cat Had Kittens, okay? Extraordinary device, unifying constructed device. Then we have a fugue, and here comes the fugue. The fugue, you have to understand, is symbolic of God's moral and universal order, because the fugue is very complex. The voices imitate each other. This is a 3-voice fugue, but the voices come in staggered entrances. And so all composers, knowing how challenging it is to write a fugue, demonstrate their worth through this medium. And here it goes. Voices coming in, the same voice coming in a staggered manner. So this fugue is built on fourths. You remember? I'm a Slav, you're a Slav. Descending fourths, but this time flipped upwards. Okay? After that, something quite extraordinary happens. Beethoven sinks back down into one of these depressed arias again. And the key of the music, which has been A flat all along, sinks a half step lower to G major. And we go like this. Aria. Six-note idea. Our cat had kittens. But this time, even more depressed, he writes, Play it as if you're losing strength and hope. He doesn't write unhope, but he means that's sort of the idea. Now, at the end of this aria, we have this extraordinary appearance of a G major chord. 10 times. Like the course of this music's direction is going to change, okay? I won't play it 10 times for the sake of time, and here we go. Another fugue. Again, I'm a Slav, you're a Slav, intervals. And just as the fugue starts to gain strength, symbolic again, not only of God's moral and universal order, but sort of the reasoning powers that he has, all right, to overcome his suffering, all of a sudden, this appears. Ich bin Luderlich, du bist Luderlich. A direct reference again to that profane tune. In the midst of this extraordinarily sacred moment in the piece. And then what happens is quite stunning. He's been struggling to get the music back up from G major back to A flat. And this is what happens in the wake of that statement. In A flat major, and the fugue theme comes in triumphantly. It triumphs. Thank you. The fugue theme triumphs, returning back to the home key of A flat in a most magnificent way. But the use of that profane tune, I'm a Slav, you're a Slav, in the context of the sacred, is a reference to the redemption of the lowly through the transcendence of these sacred symbolic references. Thank you.
Good evening. It's a pleasure to be here, a pleasure to be with my colleagues. I'm particularly pleased to say that I was on the same stage as the Exolano Project. I'll never wash this shirt again. I'm going to read a few poems from a book that I just recently finished called Dreaming the Business of Hurt. And in pulling this book together, I thought a lot about pain, obviously, which the word hurt references, but I also thought about the idea of healing. This first poem I actually wrote for my mother not long after my grandmother died. And it's a Malaysian poetic form called a pantoum. And as you listen to it, you'll hear that pantoums do very interesting things with repetition. Pantoum. Look at the distance your blood has traveled over the water. Peering out, the breeze beats behind your voice and comes unraveled. A piece of sky is dangling in the trees. Peering over the water, windows open, breeze thrashing the sea. You dream of white gloves curling against the sky. Light dangles in the trees and falls to the ground. The wind is swearing up a storm, thrashing the sea. White clouds curling around the scowl of memory. You hum a song that wind presses to the ground. Wearing linen suits, old men keep dry with bad rum, scowling as memory engulfs them. Hum, mercy, mercy, mercy. Fall on your knees. Drinking suits a bad man. Linen, gold rum, morning crashes, a blurred mirror's certainties. Ask for mercy 3 times. Drop to your knees. You could mourn every drop of rain and mimic the blurring of certainty. You could use this time. Listen to the pain unravel inside your voice as the breeze rambles the distance and beats in your blood. This next poem is called Hamilton Railroad Station, and I'm teaching the poetry workshop this semester, and I was telling my students that I think when I started this poem, my beard was black, and I was not close to collecting Social Security. But sometimes you just have to hang in there. Hamilton Railroad Station. He can't stop thinking about corn. Strong and serious as a woman, hands on her hips, waiting for the old man to come home and do damage. Black clouds, lightning and thunder, but no rain. This is a day he could love. It's so hot, sin sits closer to the ground than prayer. The crowd at the baseball field waits for the game to be called. He's looking for the last one out. The station master ambles under the clock, carrying a trumpet so shiny it could send light bounding off into space. A single note levitates loud and sweet on the air till the heat closes around it, leaving the wine of souls caught up in a soft rustle of forgetting. Bodies leaving what they need behind. If he wasn't catching this train, he'd be picking cornholes out of his nails, heading to the back door of the farmhouse to see Alma Jean before her husband gets home. She'd stare at him for 5 seconds and say, "Get on in here," like she was losing time and had a good mind to go over every inch of his body till she found it. Maybe that explains why he's come to hate the sight of a corn stalk stripped to nothing, its green husk shrugged to the ground like the dress sliding off a woman with better things to do. Looking down the tracks, he can see, clear to the next county, a crow defiant on a power line, a ribbon of lightning lashing heaven to the ground. This is called Obsidian Blues number 11. I envy bodies at rest. The robotic confidence of a sunrise when everything surrenders to the locomotion of bad choices. Grace shatters into brightness and eye storm, a lost zodiac sign concealing a hatred of metals, a nebula unworthy of the slightest throb. The air grins with regret caught in the magnetic pull of tongues, flagging our broken undertakings. Cerulean blue envelops the spacecraft's ferocious steel ache. Light speeds, kinetic energy loosed upon my blood's geometry. Iron wheel gyrating as the year pulses, sweetly sexless. A parabolic flip of the hair, rooms slanted with a sestet of ghosts, their bone tap of rhythm booming in vestibule of the soul's anxious acuity. How else explain heartbroken women humming Gershwin, light playing off their hair's marcelled waves, round tortoiseshell spectacles, sisters flawless but for the dry and meticulous nights, hissing behind lives spent dancing to equilibrium's luminous downbeat. Testament that breathing out is easy. It takes strength to draw breath again. Let all the blame echo in the blocky sadness of a monk chord, bankrupted gravitas, espionage of sweet. I wrote this poem not long after Hurricane Katrina, but the interesting thing about it is I actually didn't know I was writing about Hurricane Katrina. And actually, a friend of mine read the poem, and it was actually she who recognized that. What I was actually sort of pressing against in the poem was the tremendous human disaster that was Katrina. This is called Levee Low Moan, and it has an epigraph, which is simply graffiti on an abandoned house in post-Katrina New Orleans, which simply reads, "Destroy this memory." Levee Low Moan. Historical city of drums, humming with battery acid, convict labor, behind the school ground's toxic, lacerated walls, receding waters elaborate a frantic sweetness. Bloody chains of language travel like a river snake's question mark of venom, trundling through a dream. Prattle, a form of awe. Nightshade, thistle, and phlox, tanks of rancid coffee, mercenary ghosts. Breeze in such a lather, the spring mist may never stop dressing the sky. Shadow ambling, a woman puts on her last metaphysic, slip showing, roots in need of a touch-up. 1,000 schoolgirls reading the moan of this place, their curved shoulders bisected with sobs, and a hail of hieroglyphic fingernails, kitchens intensifying at the nape. Gaping a vehicle of such music, every camera's a gift horse. Must be these shoes talking in tongues like a symphony of screaming trees. And this joke no one gets, delirious with rhythm's cold blue fret. The heart of the artichoke judged in a clack of consonants and vowels. Ruminating on a head of lettuce with shame. A choir bone dry as a worry stone, probing gospel's evanescent sweet spot, singing just so the roof will stay up. Famine safe as any riven star. The sad regime of a storm cloud trudging across summer's sprained calculus. Creole racemen wearing one shoe, forfeiture the bread of hurt's thriving business. Nearby, a soldier shadow boxes with men in creased pants, rattling off crisp answers, waffling in a gridlock of flattery. Power unremitting, summer's testifying storm. This poem is called Omphalos. Bright blood hitting the air, the chins of arrogant boys. February rages across the eyes, pulsing as if the dark nipple of the moon, the constant spin of loss, might be a polyhedron of lack and regret. To know how it feels to know of another's knowing. The blue light falling about our heads, water dripping stone, wearing groove. Gravel is the heart never hard put to elaborate. We forget how the dead have touched us with their tundra of sad songs. Ideas I have yet to pilot, the salt on my face closing like a slow eye. When do I feel my way back to myself, born yet again as in the color of trees? Car doors pull shut, anxious to yield up their secrets. What might we make of a deep thing like rose petals? The present ache enormous, as if the body is lamp of the galaxy, your door a mind clutching. Duty of the wind, the blank wall of your back gives off the light of 10 dead stars. Wax of the moon, the eye blink of death, breasts jut out like dark water. This season, all its wounded names, sometimes there is nothing but tenderness.
Thank you, Dr. Beavers. We'll now move on to our panel discussion. I'm going to ask our professors a few questions to get the conversation going, and in about 30 minutes, we'll go to a Q&A. So remember to be thinking of your questions that you'd like to ask, and when that's that time, you guys can step up. Oh boy. So first, why do we need music and poetry? I think we've mentioned tonight a couple of things: expression, offering, triumph. But what do these forms do that perhaps the written or the visual cannot?
Sure. Well, the first thing I would say and answer that question, which I feel like I should say, is that I don't want to be in the position of sort of telling people why we need music and spoken poetry. I'm not trying to duck the question. I just think it is a personal relationship, and I certainly I don't have an answer myself. But one answer I will give to the question, I was recently reading a book by the ethnomusicologist Stephen Feld, who's a very well-known ethnomusicologist. He has a recent book out called Jazz Cosmopolitanism in Ghana. And one of the musicians he was interviewing said, music combines the spiritual and the political. And I actually thought that was a really insightful comment that's very obvious that I never thought of before. And how I take that to mean is, in the context that I'm studying, in Sri Lanka, for instance, there's a very sort of rigidly demarcated idea of what the spiritual is. But perhaps if you do not belong to a religious tradition, you could think of this as what I was essentially railing against, this kind of idea of music as personal expression that could be some spiritual connection. But I think then, because music exists in a certain context necessarily, it opens itself up to all these cultural and very quickly into sort of political discussions. So this combination of the spiritual and the political, and then I would add on top of that, we'd have to add the biological basis of music in the brain, the fact that music exists in and through time, the pulse of the heartbeat, for instance, and then the spatialization of sound within a temporal domain. So I would kind of add all those together, and I don't want to go back to dwelling on my research too much, but I will say, viewed from a cross-cultural perspective, just to take one example from my research, if we think about Buddhist monks chanting, in Sri Lanka that tradition is actually called pirit, and that word translates as protection. So the chanting of the Buddha's teachings is considered a form of protection. So I just bring that up here to say that for some people, we need music and poetry to protect people.
I've been thinking about this question, and one of the things I think in terms of the role of poetry in human history is that poetry has its beginning in song. In fact, the word poetry actually references the idea of song. So one of the things that I think about music and poetry is that on some level they're very analogous cultural forms, and in fact, they need one another. And so I was actually telling my class today that in terms of how I learned to do phrasing in my poems, Sarah Vaughan and Ella Fitzgerald are probably more important to me than a lot of poets in terms of learning how to use silence and use space in a line of poetry. So one of the things that I would say is that the idea of a poet singing has everything to do with the idea of how language may, in many instances, wash over us, but there may be that one word or that one phrase that our mind attaches to or our heart attaches to. And what I love about poetry is that it has that power to defamiliarize language and actually then refamiliarize us to it, to welcome us back inside it in ways that I think are very profound.
I like what you said, because so often, like when we study musical phrasing, because we think of it in abstract terms just through pitches and tones, we actually draw upon the rhythm of speech, to inform phrasing and articulations and that sort of thing. So there's kind of this reciprocal kind of relationship. But in terms of why we need music, that's a tough question. But one thing I will say, I don't think there's a single person on the planet that hasn't experienced the power of music, which I think is so wonderful. It's the universality of it that I think is stunning. But my area of interest is instrumental music, and it is probably the most abstract forms of musical expression because there's no text to accompany it. It's simply an arrangement and ordering of pitches and rhythms and tempo. And just keep in mind that, through the centuries, the great art form in antiquity from the beginning was poetry. And poetry was also accompanied by an instrumentalist, so it was often in the form of song. Music was always serving something else. Music was played to accompany dancers or for some ritual. For centuries, that was music's role, was to be the handmaiden or servant to some other artistic medium. It really wasn't until the modern era, until the age of the classical period, we come into the transition from the Baroque to the classical, the instrumental music starts to take off as an entity of its own. In other words, it has merit because it has theoretical underpinnings now, rigorous structure and ordering, and yet it has this power of tremendous emotional communication. So in the 1800s, aestheticians in Germany declared music had this newfound expressive power. It had finally become liberated from other art forms and reached an identity of its own, had come into its own. And that has fascinated me, because if I play some of these instrumental pieces that have absolutely no word connections, and I've played for children who maybe not have had any exposure to classical music, they all understand what is emanating from that piece emotionally. Oh, this is a sad piece, it's sorrowful. But this is really sprightly and energetic, it makes me want to dance. There is this visceral connection to music without me explaining anything. And I think that that's quite amazing, that music, which is highly ordered and organized, communicates something that transcends all barriers, cultural barriers, age, socioeconomic barriers, you name it. And therefore, it's caught my attention.
Awesome. Dr. Chung, you just mentioned the power of music, that is to protect or to serve. Why do you then study and perform? How has your art perhaps shaped you and helped you make sense of some of those things?
Sure. So this comment actually dovetails nicely off what Mia just said. That when I first started studying music in India, actually out of curiosity, I was already a performer. I played drums in many different contexts. But when I started studying Indian music, I became very fascinated by this relationship between music and society, because I felt that in the musical notes itself, the way they were ordered, were certain values embedded within the notes, within the music itself, quote unquote. And so I saw music and society as a kind of mirror relationship. Eventually, as I began studying ethnomusicology more and more, I learned that actually that relationship is, that the idea that music is this sort of pure mirror of society is actually a highly contested terrain, and that in fact, what ethnomusicologists like to say now is that music doesn't only just mirror society, it actually actively affects society. And so I think that the historical development that you're just talking about music, especially through instrumental music at a certain time in European history, becoming this kind of transcendent force, is something that's very historically acknowledged and an important development in the history of the world. But it had a side effect for when people are trying to wrap their head around music from other cultures, of thinking about music as if it was epiphenomenal, that is, as if music was purely transcendent from society and didn't actually have a role in affecting society. And so what ethnomusicologists have tried to do is accept this notion of transcendence as a historical phenomenon, but also try to actually see where that idea of transcendence has actually masked the fact that in many places around the world, music actually doesn't just have this mirror transcendence, it actually affects society itself. So when I started studying music in India, it was sort of with that perspective. And then as you can see, as I began studying Sri Lanka, I became more fascinated by the idea of music as action. But I will just say one more thing, that I am interested in taking musical concepts and ideas and working them into my own music. So in 2012, this one group I'm playing in called Invisible Things, it's a relatively new band. It's a duo with a guitar player and I actually took ideas from the drumming genre I was studying and applied them to the drum set. And in short, what that means is treating the music as a form of speech. And I could go on more about this in the question and answer period if you like, but in essence, because of certain cultural constraints in the society that I was studying, the music I studied, the drumming I studied is structured as sacred speech. So it means that it does not have this kind of very repetitive metric framework. It sounds like people are speaking sentences on the drum. And I essentially adopted that idea into a drum set, into my playing on the drum set, so that I was producing rhythmic patterns that had some sort of speech-like quality that would repeat, but not be in a metric framework. And therefore, I was trying to kind of play within a rock band format that actually changed the idea of what time, how one considers time within that format. So I guess just to sum up the answer to this question, that what I mean is one of the reasons I study and perform is because I'm interested in learning how different cultures classify and categorize music, and I use that to influence my own music at times.
In that specific example, do you find that the sacred from whence it came informs the current work you're doing now?
The sacred. Not at the moment. We have a new album we just finished. It was just mastered yesterday, actually. I still have a lot of the same ideas in there. I wouldn't say that the sacred per se was influencing that particular recording. But obviously, my immersion in various musical traditions around the world does sort of come out even when I'm not really consciously thinking of it that way.
Dr. Beavers, on why you study and perform?
You know, it's interesting because just a little autobiographical piece. When I was sitting where you guys are as an undergraduate, I was absolutely sure I was going to law school. In fact, I probably spent 98% of my undergraduate career on my way to law school. And at a certain point, it just didn't feel like the right thing to do. And I think I prayed about it and I thought about it and I thought, you know, my friends will never be friends with me anymore if I don't go to law school like they're going to law school. And it's a long way of saying that deciding to pursue a life as a writer both as a creative writer and a writer about literature. One of the things that somebody was asking me, do you draw on the same part of your brain to write poems as you do to write critical essays? And I was saying, they come from very different parts of my brain, because in scholarship, I really am trying to make an argument. And when I was in graduate school, we were trying very hard to make the argument that African American literature belonged alongside mainstream American literature. So there was a real press to make arguments. But I think when I write poetry, I'm much more interested in the unfinished and the sort of larger question that I can't answer. And so by virtue of that, they're two really radically different things for me, but I would be incomplete if I didn't do both. And so in terms of that question, how has your art shaped you and helped you make sense of the world? I think for me, as a scholar, I'm really interested in why people write particular books or particular poems or particular short stories at a particular point in time, trying to answer what does it mean to be human. And I think as an artist, I'm really interested in not answering that question, but really trying to sort of engage the question, what does it mean for me to try and be human? And poems are very much about really sort of slowing down. Listening to the end of Levy Lomon, I know that I have more work to do on that last line. It's like, and poetry really sort of demands that you take time and really grapple sometimes with 3 or 4 or 5 words and move them around and grapple with them. And that is a tremendously liberating thing to do as a human being, to slow down and care about words in that way. And at a time when we are sort of bombarded with so much language, getting up at 5:45 this morning and grappling with that, I think is one of the best things that you can do.
Well, I'm going to sort of speak from a very personal angle. I started, as you know, at a young age playing the piano when I was 7. And after I declared I was going to become a concert pianist when I was 9, I sort of plunged myself into this exploration of music and identity, of what it means to be an artist or a musician. By the age of 12, I had sort of come up with this construct in my mind that an artist is someone who's, is set apart from the world. In other words, they don't follow the things that perhaps their peers are captivated by, like fashion and, cool gizmos and that sort of a thing. I was already trying to distance myself from my peers, and I realized that my pursuit of this sort of ascetic life, apart from the world, was a search for this kind of pure existence. It's hard to believe I was thinking this at 12, right? It was really kind of strange. But in the end, as I process all of this now as an adult, what I realized, I was on a quest for identity. I wanted to know what this music making was about, why I was able to do it, and what I was going to use it for. And in this quest for identity, I was able to recognize the thrill of being good at something. And I thought, but why am I good at this? I know I practice it, but it seems some things come really naturally to me. And as I pursued this question, I also was concurrently thinking about Christianity. And my parents were not Christians initially, but in their 40s, they came to Christ. And sort of at the same time, I was thinking about how my faith life, or potential faith life, was going to interact with my identity as a musician. And what I came to realize was that being on stage and playing sort of for my own gratification was kind of an empty exercise. And I wanted purpose and meaning that was simply beyond applause and accolade. Just being great was not good enough. And in light of becoming a Christian, in the aftermath of that, what I came to realize was that I experienced far greater joy knowing that I, being created in the image of God, with the ability to create and do something wonderful, could be basically providing glory to my Maker. In other words, I was reveling in this great music. It was a reflection of God's greatness. And that, to me, was far more empowering and joy-filled than the pursuit of simply excellence and applause. So that was, I think, a huge, huge event in my life when I realized that there could be meaning beyond myself. And just to tie that into the first question, I really do feel that the arts, in their various manifestations in music, poetry, what have you, literature, are just signs of the grand and even greater creative force of God. They're just little glimpses of what His glory is about.
Dr. Chung, you spoke about Beethoven being a celebrity and slob. Dr. Beavers, you talked about how your book deals specifically with pain. And Dr. Sykes, you spoke to being in Sri Lanka during the war. I mean, these are three very different things, but at the same time, they point to this occurrence of human suffering. And I'm interested in how we use music and poetry to react to that, and how art may help us overcome our suffering or give us hope in those situations.
Sure. Well, I have a lot of stories I could tell in this regard. One of them just jumps to my mind immediately. In just this January, 2013, I got to travel to Jaffna in northern Sri Lanka for the first time. This was a region that was off limits for field workers since the early 80s because of the war. It was really the most heavily hit part of Sri Lanka, and the people who live there are mainly Tamils. So remember I was speaking about Sinhala Buddhist culture previously. This is the different community. One of the musicians I met there was just this really fascinating individual who unfortunately couldn't leave his house for about 10 years. Because when things got really bad, I mean, the war started in 1983, but by about 1994, the Sri Lankan military had taken over this area of Sri Lanka, and there were checkpoints all around. And I'm assuming he must have left the house to get food. I mean, it's not like he had a farm on his yard. I mean, he was living in urban, in a city. But leaving the house would take about 4 hours to go through a checkpoint or something. And so it just eventually became too difficult to even leave the house, really. And he did tell me a story that he was trapped in the house for a couple days straight. There was one particularly bad time where he just had to wait it out. And he told this really dramatic, gruesome story, too, about a shootout that occurred right outside his house for hours. And then eventually there was silence, and he kind of pokes his head out and sees both parties basically lying dead on the street right in front of his house. So one sort of imagines, what does music mean in that case? And this individual's father was a pretty well-known musician in this area of Sri Lanka, and his brother, this person's name is Murali, I should tell you his name. Murali's brother moved to Tamil Nadu. He sort of got out before the war started. Tamil Nadu is an area of South India where there are many Tamil speakers. And his brother works in the film industry. So once the internet started getting going, Murali wound up composing songs for films and sending them over the internet to his brother in South India. And I just thought this is amazing, because here you have someone who's physically trapped and emotionally and imaginatively, I don't want to say free per se, but free enough to compose this music and to actually send it online. Now, I will have a disclaimer that I don't think the internet has granted freedom for everyone. I'm a skeptic about the good of the internet in many ways. However, here is a case of, let's talk about the gift again. He's able to offer this music online, and it enables him to sort of escape the war zone in a way. And so I don't know, I just think that there definitely is this connection between music self and suffering and overcoming suffering that we should acknowledge as a sort of human phenomenon. And a lot of my work now is on what I'm calling the musicology of freedom, and considering these relationships of individuals, whether they're sort of refugees or this is someone sort of physically trapped in a war zone, how people use music to achieve some kind of personal liberation, even if it's not a political liberation, like an actual kind of personal liberation, or what that sort of means. So, so that's one way that I think music can interact with suffering. And I'll just sort of conclude my answer to this question by saying also, because music rearticulates the relationship between the spiritual and the political, it can allow for a renegotiation of one's identity, potentially in the public sphere. So here we come back to the idea that there can be an attachment to music and identity, even though I've just sort of debunked the idea. This can actually occur for people, and music can actually be a way to renegotiate one's identity, and again, this connection between the spiritual and the political is sort of bringing the self and the community out into the public sphere, which could potentially, I would say, overcome suffering if you have suffering for a community, let's say.
Poetry and suffering. The way that these things work, I decided, when I decided not to go to law school, I decided that I wanted to go study poetry with a poet at Brown University named Michael S. Harper. And I sort of took the leap of faith. So I get the call on a Thursday that they're offering me a full fellowship to come to Brown. And literally, the next morning, my father died. And I had to sort of confront the idea, there was this thing that you wanted, but what did it cost you to have it? And so my 2 years at Brown, I really think I was just clothed in grief that I couldn't even fully express. But what makes it really an important time and a time that I really cherish are two things. One, I had my first apartment. And so I could play my music as loud as I wanted because I had an apartment in the basement. And I played a lot of jazz and a lot of gospel music and a lot of rhythm and blues, and music for me is healing. But the other thing is this. I think I was really interested in your story, Mia, about your professor saying that there was a disconnect. And I think for me, up until that point, there was a real disconnect for me with poetry. It was something that people knew that I did. I published my first poem when I was 17. But in a lot of ways, there was a real disconnect emotionally. And I was in Michael Harper's office one afternoon, and I think he knew how much I was grieving and how hard I was trying to mask over the grief. And he pulled out this poem by one of my favorite poets, who's a poet also from Ohio, like I am, named James Wright. And he has a poem called Honey. And the end of the poem is, my father died a good death. I do not, which is to say he lived his life. I do not say a good life. I say a life. And I think Michael Harper must have known that I needed to hear that poem, because on some level, I was very interested in Sam's poem where he talked about the fact that he writes about his father all the time, because I think I write about my father all the time. And one of the things that I think you do as a poet is that your work really sort of comes out of finding your material at a certain point in time. And I think for me, I probably didn't really begin to find my material until my late 20s, my early 30s even. And I'm just now starting to feel able to write poems about growing up in my father's house that are difficult poems to write. I mean, there's a new book that I've been working on, and I swear I cannot read the poems after I write them without crying. So on some level, poetry is both the avenue to suffering, but obviously it's also the manner in which suffering is poetry's soundtrack, and it's the way that we find our way in the darkness. So that for me, the question of suffering is always, for me, very close to contiguous with the idea of finding hope. Because on some level in my life, at those times when I felt at my most downtrodden, it's also those moments when you have these epiphanies about what it means to live. And I don't mean that to sound deeply philosophical, but I do mean it to suggest that on some level, I think for me, I turned the corner as a writer when I realized that you have to have pain to be a writer, and you have to be willing to walk up close to that pain. Not because you ever think you'll fully understand it, but because on some level, for me, as somebody that is a believer in God, and I accept Christ as my Savior, because on some level the pain is liberating, and not liberating in a definitive sense, but liberating in the sense that you can make it to the next day. I mean, I think this is what the blues is about. The blues is about metaphorizing your realization that you can keep going. And so for me, when I think about suffering, I think about the way in which it's also the sort of letter that you get in the mail that says you can keep going.
Right. Boy, I mean, I think about if there weren't suffering, you know, all the great works of art and literature and music that were informed by suffering, we would lose all of that, right? And without suffering, we wouldn't know what joy is. But I mean, I agree with you that ultimately this all points to the idea of hope, right? And for me, one of the things that I find fascinating about all these forms of expression, communication, is the narrative element in all of this. And, you know, in the Christian worldview, you have a broad narrative that anchors the Old Testament and New Testament, and that is, of course, the creation, the original creation, and then the fall, right, through sin, and the redemption through Christ, and then ultimately restoration. And the fact that so much of our creative activity is about this process, this narrative process, that it reflects that. So what fascinates me is across cultural boundaries, across political divide and socioeconomics, you see the recurrence of these fascinations emanating from peoples around the world, and all clamoring in the midst of strife and dissonance and sorrow for hope and transcendence. Then I think in the Christian perspective, of course, this is all really to direct our attention to the ultimate creator. I love what C.S. Lewis once said. He said, you know what, we desire too little. We don't desire enough, because instead of looking and reaching for the ultimate, which is a relationship with God, we fascinate ourselves with the things that are here. We're half-hearted creatures. And so, what do? We idolize the great musician on stage, or we worship the great composer who wrote that great music, when instead we should be really reaching for the ultimate creator who created those gifts to begin with. And so, for me, I think that sums it up, this idea of making us look upward and to strive for transcendence over our reality.
Thank you all for your very thoughtful answers. And now we'll go to the Q&A portion. So if you have a question, you guys, there are mics in the center, in the far aisles, and you can step up and we'll call on you if you have questions for our panelists.
Hello. Hi. My name is John. I have a question for Dr. Beavers. So the Exolano project performed tonight, but they're certainly not the only student artists here. And I was wondering if you had any advice to those of us that are trying to work through things through art. Can you speak to that?
After I published my first poetry book, Michael Harper sent me a postcard, and he said, "It occurs to me I don't praise you enough. So I'm praising you now." do more. That's my advice.
Thank you.
Could I just add to that? Actually, I'm sorry, I'm not a poet, but
Go ahead.
J.S. Bach, when he was asked by his sons, CPE and JC, Dad, how do you write these 7-voice fugues? They're so extraordinary. He said, sons, if you worked as hard, you too could write these fugues. And so working at it, discipline, day after day, slogging it out, even when there really is nothing you feel to sustain your creative energy, is really, I think, the answer.
A line of one of your poems, sometimes there's nothing but tenderness. And I feel that this is a sentiment that's often lacking from poetry. Are there any other feelings or sentiments that either of you three think are lacking from art or from music or poetry?
One of the things that I don't get on my soapbox very often about poetry because I think this is such a tremendously exciting time for poetry in the United States, poetry in the world, actually. I was in China about 5 years ago, and they knew my poems. It was really, now I thought, y'all got 1 billion people and y'all know my poems, really? But I was really interested in the manner in which poetry really demands that we talk outside of our community, and I think that there are lots of poets that want to talk within their sort of small circle. And I think the real challenge of poetry, and I think this is something that was a real challenge for me as an African American poet, was to find ways to talk outside of communities that I felt or feel comfortable in. And there's always sort of the self-consciousness that you feel when you're reading with a lot of poets and people are reacting to perhaps the more sensational stuff, and my stuff is not sensational, I don't think, but it's an offering, and so I think what I often lament is poetry that is really sort of settled on giving us the answer. I think I resist that in my own work. That when I feel like I've come to too sort of neat and pat an answer, I really sort of put the poem away. And I think about it some more, because for me, again, as a scholar, I really am interested in winning the argument. As a poet, I'm interested in starting the argument, and those are radically different postures.
Something to add to that, actually. I would say from a musical perspective, I definitely don't see a lot of lack, quote unquote, in that there's I'm just constantly amazed at how much great stuff there is that's going on, how much music is transforming, how many interesting sounds I'm encountering all the time. So I definitely don't approach music as being, anything missing today. But I will get on my soapbox for a minute and say, I do think that society needs to develop more respect for musicians. And I'm not going to give you a diatribe against illegal downloading, but we are in a new era, and I've been lucky enough to know a decent amount of professional musicians, some of whom have played very large music festivals and get written up in the press all the time, and et cetera, et cetera. And you know what? When they're not touring, they're bartenders. They're still sleeping on floors as they travel around. It's really hard to make a living. That's not to discourage anyone, because I would actually actively encourage you. But I'll just sort of pose the question that next time you see an article on the state of the music industry ask yourself how much the article is actually concerned with the fate of musicians, because usually they talk about the industry and they talk about consumers, and what gets left out is how are musicians going to keep doing what they're doing given the fact that it's virtually impossible to make money off music anymore. Now, with that impossibility, quote unquote, is a kind of liberation where people are managing to have different careers that are sustaining themselves and they can still do music. And I want to try to actively encourage you and be positive here. However, if there's anything lacking regarding music today, I think it's a public discourse of appreciation for musicians and an active kind of caring for musicians. That's what I see missing.
Can I follow that up? I just think, at least particularly in American culture, there's such a consumerist mindset when it comes to music, like consuming music because it makes you feel good or it's great, to exercise to or whatever. But I don't hear the conversation of using music as a way of reflecting and reaching for something greater. And I really want to encourage that, because we are much more than simply physical beings who respond to visceral stimuli, but to pursue that which ennobles and removes us from our day-to-day grind. So I think that's really important.
Veritas at Penn wants to create relevant and thought-provoking and engaging events to people of all backgrounds and beliefs, and we need your guys' help with that. So in your bulletins as you came in today, there are these white cards, and those are a survey. So take 60 seconds to fill those things out. We'll only use your email address to send you a link to a feedback site. And we won't email you about anything else unless you check the boxes at the bottom of the card, or unless you win the raffle for the iPad, and we'll email you to let you know about that. And we'll take just our last question. I saw that over there. We'll take our last question in a second. But please drop off your survey with an usher as you exit the auditorium. And then we'll hear our last question, and we'll wrap up.
So many people believe that music and poetry evokes and expresses emotions and visceral experiences that can't be otherwise expressed. And in fact, in the creation of art, a lot of artists don't fully understand all the meanings that their art expresses in the creation of it and even after it's created. So I guess I was just wondering, where do you believe inspiration comes from in the creation of art, music, and poetry?
Okay. Well, once again, I think it's a very, I'd have to say it's a very personal decision. I think inspiration comes from many different areas, whether it's a domain of thought, whether it's somewhere in your head, or whether it's something in society that you've learned. So I'm not trying to duck the question. I mean, I think that when you study music around the world, you realize that different cultures foster sort of different sorts of inspirations for musicians. But I'll just take, just give a short answer here and say that I think it's very personal and diverse. I don't actually have an answer to the question.
If I don't have an answer either. If I did, I would not be teaching at Penn. I'd be really rich. But I think that one of the things that really interests me about inspiration is that you have absolutely no control over it whatsoever. There's nothing you can do to move yourself into that space. At least I don't have the ability to move myself into that space. And so being inspired, to actually sit down and start writing a poem, I always think that that's a miracle. Because every time I write a poem, I never think I'm going to write another poem. And so when I start another poem, and I look at the end of the year, and I look on my computer, and I see that I've written all of these poems. Some of them are terrible, and they will never see the light of day. Mm-hmm. But just the fact that it comes, and sometimes it comes, and you don't even know that it's come. One of the things I do with my poems is I write my poems and I put them away, and you sort of pull them out a year later, and you say, "Oh my God, where did that come from?" So on some level, I think one of the blessings that God gives us is that He doesn't always make it clear to us that we're inspired. that sometimes we sort of act blindly. We are inspired, but we're not acting out of, wow, I'm inspired. Because I think on some level, as human beings, that will really burn us out. But I like the idea of inspiration being this thing that occupies you in ways that you may not even be able to name. And that is a tremendous gift, I think.
I think, it's so funny, we have such a romanticized notion nowadays of what inspiration is, that somehow it's this spontaneous creation of something that is like, wow. But the fact of the matter is, it's really rooted in discipline, daily discipline. And you referenced this, just the miracle of getting up and writing poetry every day, even when you just feel completely dry of ideas or inspiration. But it's the steady discipline of doing that day in and day out. It seems so mundane sometimes. And then all of a sudden, for some unknown reason, you feel inspired. That is sort of the magical nature of art. What I think is so amazing at the same time is that other people know when you're inspired via your art. I think that's remarkable. I mean, and in many ways reflects sort of the communicative relationship that we have with God. God communicates with us and we communicate with God. It's a very personal thing. Same thing, we reflect as examples of people or creation that was created in the image of God, beings created in the image of God, that we want to communicate with each other. And we all know when the message is great, and we also know when the message isn't. And especially in music, we know when a melody is really well written, and we don't. I think that's just quite phenomenal, mystical and phenomenal.
Hearing you both talk just made me think of one personal story for me that kind of combines both of these comments. And I do think that discipline is really important to inspiration, because I think, sure, you can be inspired even if you have no background in a certain artistic tradition, but I think that when you work really, really hard for it, and there's a certain moment where it happens, there's just something special about that moment that you never forget, and it sort of inspires you when you're in that moment, and that inspiration kind of helps you achieve the moment. So I'm thinking, for instance, the movie that came out several years ago, Black Swan. Many people, you can analyze this movie from many different directions, but the way I interpreted the ending was it seemed as if the performer she'd worked her whole life for this performance, she achieved perfection, and then she just dies. And you can view that from so many different angles, but I'm happy to report that with that first album with my new group I mentioned, where I borrowed ideas from Sri Lankan drumming, I felt like I had my Black Swan moment, but thankfully, knock on wood, I'm still here, where the piece we're performing, it was an hour of music, and it's one long composition, but there's all this improvisation, and once you're in it, you got to go in it with it, because if you're messing up, you're doing the whole thing again. Obviously, we could cut and splice these days, cut and paste that is in the studio, but we just got in the zone and did it, and it was just sort of this really fascinating moment for me, because I kind of felt like I had been working all my life as an artist just to get to that moment, and I just remember being in it and the sort of inspiration, and of course I'm definitely sort of romanticizing the inspiration here, but I guess the point I'm driving home here is that you keep working for it, and just kind of put yourself in it, and into the work, invest in it, and it's just the discipline mixed with the moment, and it can happen. And so that, to me, is I suppose how I define inspiration. So.
But it's really interesting, because in the class that I'm teaching this semester, I'm teaching a novel next week called Ox Herding Tale, and in that novel there's a character called the Coffin Maker, and somebody asked him, well, how do you make coffins? And he says, well, look, when somebody asks me to make a coffin, I go into the woods for a week. And after 2 days, I forget that somebody asked me to make a coffin. And after 4 days, I forget that I make coffins. And after 6 days, I forget myself. He said, when that happens, I start looking for a tree that wants to be a coffin. And I think now it's Charles Johnson is a Buddhist, the person that wrote that novel. So you actually could find that he has taken that sort of moment in his novel from the Tao to King. But I really do when I write poetry, that's my process. I sort of forget that anybody's ever liked my poems. I forget that I forget how I wrote the last poem that I wrote that I thought worked, and ultimately I forget about whether people are going to like it. And that was tremendously liberating for me when I realized, you know what, you can't worry about whether or not people are going to like it. I mean, obviously, I'm human. I don't want people to throw rotten vegetables at me, but on some level, you will be hamstrung as an artist if you are worried about what people think. And the whole idea of forgetting myself is really sort of my way of getting to that place. Because ultimately, I think William Carlos Williams is right. Poetry makes nothing happen, but thank God that we have it.
Thank you guys so much. Let's give a round of applause to all our presenters tonight.
Thanks.
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at veritas.org.